Follow with side freebistons. We have
The morning I walked into that boardroom, I had not had my name on a legal document in 38 years. And the man sitting in the chair where my husband used to sit had taken $3.1 million out of the company I helped build through a shell company in Delaware over 5 years, while I stayed too busy holding everything together to notice, and called it love. He believed I was grieving, distracted, that after nearly 4 decades of invisibility, I would stay that way. What I had just understood, sitting alone the night before with the documents spread across my desk, was that the most devastating thing was never the money, but that I had given the best years of my life to people I should never have trusted. I want to tell you what happened when I walked through that door. To tell that story, I need to go back 18 months to the morning I returned to the office for the first time after my husband died. Dale had been gone a year and a half. I had been managing the company remotely, signing what needed to be signed, approving what needed to be approved, without ever once setting foot in the building we had built together. I had not been inside it since the week after the funeral. I had driven past it twice, once to pick up a box of personal items that someone had packed for me without being asked, and once by accident on a route I should have known to avoid. Both times I had not stopped. Both times I had looked straight ahead and kept driving. The building was a 6-story commercial property in Midtown Nashville, the kind that had been renovated just enough to look intentional without losing the original bones. Dale and I had signed the lease on our floor in the late 1980s, when we were too young to be certain about anything and too certain to admit it. 30 years later, our name was still on the directory in the lobby, though only his name, not mine. I had never asked for it to be added. I had told myself that was not the kind of thing that mattered. I made 2 cups of coffee that morning before I left the house. This is a detail I need you to understand because it matters more than it seems. I had been making 2 cups every morning for 38 years. One for me, one for Dale. It was the first thing I did each day before checking my phone or reading anything. After he died, I kept making 2. I would set the second one on the counter and let it go cold and stand there looking at it for longer than I should have. I did not know how to stop. I parked in the corner spot in the back lot, the one I had parked in for more than 3 decades. I sat in the car for a few minutes. The building looked the same as it always had. Of course it did. Buildings do not adjust themselves for grief. The lobby was quiet. It was early, before most of the staff had arrived. I took the elevator to the 4th floor and walked down the hallway to my office and unlocked the door and went inside. Someone had kept the desk clear. I did not know who. The chair had been pushed in precisely, which was not how I left it. The window looked out over the street below, and the morning light was doing the specific thing it does in early spring in Nashville, which is arriving at an angle that makes ordinary objects look briefly significant. I sat down. I had told myself I was coming in to review the estate documentation, to begin the formal process of accounting for what Dale had left behind. This was true. What was also true though I had not yet said it to myself clearly, was that I had come in because I needed to be inside the thing we had built together, even if only to sit in it quietly and understand what it was now that he was gone. I opened the distribution reports first. I had always managed the distribution accounts. It was one of those divisions of labor that had never been formally decided. It had simply become true over time because I was better at it and cared more about the details and was willing to sit with columns of numbers at 10:30 at night, when the alternative was worrying about something I could not fix. The first report looked normal. The second looked normal. The third had a line item that was not normal, though it took me a moment to identify why. A payment to an administrative services provider, $12,000, quarterly, recurring. I did not recognize the name of the provider. I had not approved it. That distinction mattered enormously. I went back through the previous year's reports. The payment appeared in each one. I went back further. It had been there for longer than a year. I pulled up the original distribution contract and compared it to the version currently on file. The two documents were not identical. Someone had amended the contract. I sat very still for a moment. The morning light was still doing its thing with the window. Outside on the street, a delivery truck was making its careful way through the intersection. Everything was proceeding as it always did. I did not feel afraid. What I felt was the particular clarity that comes when something you have been dimly aware of for a long time finally resolves into focus. I wrote down the name of the administrative services provider on a piece of paper and put it in my coat pocket. Then I closed the reports and sat with what I had found in the office where I had worked without credit for 38 years, and I let myself understand that what I was looking at was not an accident. To understand what I found in that folded report, you have to understand what I built and how completely I built it without ever asking for recognition. I spent 38 years making sure that companies survived every mistake, every market shift, and every contract that could have buried us. What I found in that report told me someone else had spent considerable time making sure it would not survive me. I was 27 years old when I met Dale Calloway at a small recording session in the basement of a converted warehouse on the east side of Nashville. The year was 1985. I had been working as a bookkeeper for a regional music distributor, keeping the kind of meticulous records that made my supervisor nervous because they revealed exactly how much money the company was quietly losing. Dale was the guitarist in the session, not the headliner, but the most magnetic presence in the room. He had a way of taking up space without demanding it, a quality I had never quite encountered before and have not encountered since. He played 3 chords in the second hour, and the entire room shifted toward him without anyone seeming to notice they had moved. He was brilliant in the way that certain musicians are brilliant, instinctively and entirely without system. He could hear a song's weakness in the first 8 bars and know exactly how to fix it. What he could not do was read a contract without his eyes glazing over by the second paragraph. He could not remember to file quarterly tax documents on time. He could not hold a conversation with an investor without wandering off into a story about a recording he had done in Memphis that had nothing to do with the meeting at hand. I could do all of those things. We were married in 1987 in a small ceremony at a botanical garden outside the city. 3 months later, we signed the lease on a ground floor space in downtown Nashville and opened what would eventually become Callaway Records. There was no formal agreement about who would do what. It simply emerged. The way roles always emerge in a partnership where one person faces forward and the other holds the entire structure together from behind. Dale wrote the music, made the calls, shook the hands, and charmed every person who walked through the door. I read the contracts, built the filing systems, managed the quarterly accounts, and quietly corrected every mistake before it had the chance to become a crisis. That was how we operated for 38 years. The first genuine test came in 2003. A distribution company had sent over an agreement that appeared entirely routine at a glance, but contained, buried in the fifth addendum, a clause that would have transferred effective control of our entire publishing catalog to them for 15 years in the event of any payment dispute. I found it at 10:30 at night while Dale was asleep in the next room. I called our attorney at 11 o'clock, spent 2 hours walking through the language line by line, and had a revised contract ready before Dale arrived for breakfast the following morning. He signed the corrected version without reading it, kissed me on the cheek, and said I was the sharpest person he had ever known. Then he left for a lunch meeting and did not mention it again. That was the pattern for 38 years. I never asked for credit. I want to be clear about that because it matters. I did not stay silent out of protest or resentment. I made a choice again and again to let the work speak for itself without needing my name attached to it. I told myself it was humility. I told myself it was partnership. What I did not tell myself, because I was not yet ready to hear it, was that I was also afraid that asking for recognition would somehow diminish what we had built together. That naming my contribution out loud would make it transactional rather than love. The one time I came close was in 2009. We had been approached about a major licensing deal that would have restructured the ownership entity of the label, and the attorneys involved had asked for a complete list of principles. I sat across from Dale in the kitchen one evening and said, quietly and without drama, that I believed my name should appear on the documentation. Dale looked at me for a long moment. He did not say no. He said something that felt, in that particular moment, like tenderness. He told me I was the heart of the place and that a heart did not need its name on the wall to know what it was doing. He reached across the table and covered my hand with his. I let him. I did not push further. I told myself I did not need to. Now, sitting at my desk in the office we had built together, I looked out through the window at the sign above the entrance. Callaway Records, a single surname in clean block letters against a dark background. The morning light hit those letters at a particular angle that I had always thought looked distinguished. I had never stopped to consider how long I had reserved that word for the sign and not for myself. I had walked past it thousands of times. The name on it was not mine. The woman who had read every contract that protected everything behind it was nowhere on it. She had never been anywhere on it. I reached into my bag and touched the folded report. 38 years of choosing not to ask for my name on a piece of paper. 38 years of calling that choice love. The absence of my name from the ownership structure of this company was not a sentimental oversight. It was a legal gap. And somewhere inside the pattern I had found in those distribution numbers, someone had noticed that gap long before this morning. Someone had been counting on it. Dale had been married once before he met me. Her name was Janet, and their marriage ended when their son Ryan was 6 years old. I knew this from the beginning, and I want to be honest about something that took me much longer to admit. The knowledge made me careful with Ryan in a way that was not always fair to either of us. I was the second wife. I entered his life with that label already attached, and I spent years trying to earn a different one without ever quite succeeding. Ryan was 8 years old the first time Dale brought him to the office. I remember the afternoon clearly. Dale had been building toward it for weeks, telling Ryan about the studio, the equipment, the artists who came through, the way a song got made from nothing into something a person might hear on the radio for the rest of their life. He wanted his son to feel the same thing he felt when he walked through that door. He wanted to share it. I was at my desk when they arrived. Dale came in first, holding Ryan by the shoulder, with the kind of pride that does not need to explain itself. The boy looked around the room, and I watched his eyes move. They did not stop on the mixing board. They did not stop on the guitars mounted along the wall, or the platinum records in their frames, or the photographs of artists who had recorded here when the studio was still new. His eyes moved past all of it and settled on the row of filing cabinets along the far wall. He looked at them for a moment, and then he looked up at his father and asked how much we made in royalties every year. Dale laughed and said something about how Ryan was going to be a businessman. I smiled because that was the appropriate response, but I was standing close enough to see the boy's face when he asked the question, and there was no curiosity in it. There was only calculation. I did not know what to do with that observation, so I filed it away and said nothing. That was the first time I said nothing about Ryan. It was not the last. He grew into a man who was very difficult to dislike and nearly impossible to fully trust. He was charming in the specific way that people are charming when they have studied what charm requires. He shook hands at the right moment and asked the right questions and remembered details about people that made them feel they mattered to him. He knew how to make Dale proud, which was its own form of intelligence. What he could not do, in all the years I observed him, was be genuinely interested in something that did not eventually benefit him. When Dale offered Ryan the position of vice president of operations the spring after he graduated from business school, I said nothing. I had reasons that I told myself were practical. Ryan had a degree. He was willing. He wanted to be involved. What I did not say, not to Dale and not to myself, was that the more honest reason for my silence was the old familiar guilt of the second wife. I had no right to stand between a father and his son. I had no standing to question the arrangement. So I did not question it. I absorbed it the way I had absorbed a great many things over the years, quietly and without complaint. Dale's health began to decline in the fall of 2019. It was gradual at first, then faster than any of us were prepared for. During that period, Ryan stepped into the operational role with an efficiency that everyone remarked on. He was present. He was organized. He handled the day-to-day management with what appeared to be genuine competence. One of the first things he did was restructure the format of the financial reporting system, citing a need for what he called a more streamlined interface. He explained it to me in language that was detailed enough to sound credible and vague enough to avoid real scrutiny. I asked one question. He answered it smoothly. I did not ask a second question because I was sitting with Dale at the hospital 3 afternoons a week, and my attention was not where it needed to be. I understand that now. I understood it even then. In some part of myself, I was not ready to examine. On the morning Dale died, I was sitting in the chair beside his bed when his breathing finally went still. The nurses came. The doctor came. I sat with him for a while longer because I was not ready to walk out of that room and into a world where he was past tense. At some point, I became aware of Ryan's voice in the hallway outside. He was on his phone. I caught only a fragment through the door, a sentence or two, before the sound of a cart moving down the corridor covered it. He was calling the company's attorney, not the funeral home, not a family member, not anyone whose involvement would have made sense in the first hour after a man's death. He was calling the company's attorney, and his voice had the clipped, directed quality of someone who had been waiting to make that call and was relieved to finally be making it. I told myself it was grief. I told myself people handle loss in unexpected ways, that some people reach for practical things because the emotional ones are too large. I told myself I was wrong about what I had heard. I reached into my bag now and pressed my fingers against the folded report. I had not been wrong about what I heard. I had simply not been ready in that hallway to understand what it meant. Ryan had not started preparing when Dale died. He had started preparing long before that, and he had been waiting with the patience of someone who understood exactly how long patience takes for the moment he could begin. I stayed late at the office for 3 nights in a row without telling anyone why. This was not unusual behavior for me. I had been doing important work in silence for 38 years, and the habit did not require explanation or company. I waited each evening until the last staff member had gone. And then I sat in the quiet building with the accounting system open and the city going dark outside the window. And I looked for what I already suspected was there. The pattern I had found in the distribution figures was not a random error. Random errors scatter. They occur in different line items at different intervals with no internal logic. What I was seeing had logic. It had architecture. Whoever had designed this had built it to resemble the ordinary friction of doing business, the kind of cost variance that a competent but overworked bookkeeper would note and then accept as a reasonable fluctuation. The problem was that I was not an overworked bookkeeper. I was the woman who had built the filing systems in this building and memorized the operating costs of this company the way other people memorize the faces of people they love. By the second night, I had traced the outflow to its source. The money was moving through a digital distribution contract, a licensing agreement for streaming and download platforms that Ryan had quietly amended in the period when Dale's health first began to decline. In the year Dale stopped attending board meetings in person because the drive had become too much for him. The original contract had been standard language, something I had reviewed and approved years earlier. The amended version contained a secondary disbursement clause directing a percentage of net royalty receipts to a third-party administrative services provider. The clause was embedded in an addendum written in the dense, recursive language of entertainment law, the kind that communicates its meaning only to people who are looking for it specifically. I was looking for it specifically. The third-party administrator was listed as Meridian Sound Partners, LLC, registered in the state of Delaware. I searched for Meridian Sound Partners online that same night. There was no website, no office address beyond the registered agent in Delaware, no staff directory, no press mentions, no industry presence of any kind. There was only a registration record, an entity number, and a bank account into which money from Callaway Records had been flowing at regular intervals for 5 years. I called the one person I trusted with this. Her name was Barbara, and we had worked together at the regional distributor 30 years earlier, before I left to build Callaway Records with Dale. She had spent those 30 years in forensic accounting, and she owed me nothing, which was exactly why I trusted her. I sent her the documents that evening, and she called me back at 2 o'clock in the morning with a voice that had the careful, measured quality of someone delivering information they wished they did not have. $3.1 million. That was the total she calculated had passed through the Meridian structure over the course of 5 years, drawn from the royalty revenue of Callaway Records through a distribution contract that had been amended without my knowledge or signature. She told me the construction of the agreement was sophisticated enough that a standard audit would likely have flagged it eventually, but probably not for another 2 or 3 years. Whoever had done this understood how long institutional oversight takes. I thanked her and sat alone in the building for a long time after she hung up. Then I looked up the incorporation date for Meridian Sound Partners. The entity had been registered 6 years ago, not 3 months before Dale died, not in the weeks when everything was falling apart. 6 years ago, during a period when Dale was still well enough to play golf on Saturdays and argue about guitar tone in the recording studio. The filing had been submitted quietly through a registered agent in Delaware in the same month that Ryan had asked Dale for an expanded operational role with access to the company's financial systems. I remembered that conversation. I had been in the next room. I had heard Dale say yes with the warmth of a father who believed he was investing in his son's future. He had no idea he was handing Ryan the combination to a lock Ryan had already planned to open. Ryan had not waited for his father to get sick. He had not waited for an opportunity to present itself. He had arrived at Callaway Records with a plan already in motion, had asked for the keys while appearing simply to want more responsibility, and had begun drawing from the company within months of receiving the access he had requested. I sat with that for a long time. I did not feel fear. I felt the particular cold of a person who has just understood the full dimensions of something they had been living inside without knowing its shape. For 38 years, I had worked alongside Dale, and in those years, Ryan had come and gone through our lives as the difficult, careful, occasionally warm presence that complicated relationships sometimes produce. I had not liked him, but I had never imagined this. I had assumed ambition without calculating its scale. I printed everything: the distribution contract and its amendment, the Meridian Incorporation documents, the 5-year transaction record Barbara had compiled. The printer ran for several minutes. I gathered the pages, tapped them into alignment against the desk, and slid them into a folder. When I stood up, my legs were not entirely steady. I noticed this the way you notice weather, as a condition external to yourself, something to be acknowledged and moved through. I pressed both palms flat against the desk for a moment. I breathed. Then I picked up the folder and walked to my car. There was a great deal I needed to do, and not very much time in which to do it. Ryan called on a Tuesday morning to say he was coming to Nashville for the weekend and wanted to take me to dinner. He said he had been worried about me. He said he had been thinking about how much I was carrying on my own, and that he wanted to see for himself that I was doing all right. He said all of this in the warm, unhurried voice of a concerned son. And if I had not spent 3 nights in the office tracing $3.1 million into a shell company he had registered while his father was dying, I might have found the call genuinely comforting. He arrived on a Friday evening with a bunch of flowers from the market near the highway, the kind that look thoughtful without having required much thought. He hugged me in the doorway, held the embrace a beat longer than necessary, and asked how I was sleeping. Sarah was already there. She had driven up from her apartment that afternoon, and the 3 of us sat down to the dinner I had prepared with the surface composure of a family navigating grief and leaning on each other, which is exactly what we appeared to be. The food was warm. The conversation was careful. Anyone watching from the outside would have seen a family holding itself together with reasonable grace. I had spent 38 years reading contracts for hidden meaning. I could sit at a dinner table and track every sentence. Ryan was skilled at this kind of evening. He moved the conversation with the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed the rhythm without making it look rehearsed. He talked about Dale, which was the right thing to do, and he did it with the correct mixture of warmth and appropriate sadness. He talked about the music industry, about changes in the streaming landscape, about the challenges facing independent labels. He talked about legacy and what it means to build something that outlasts you. He did not, at any point in the first hour, say directly what he was moving toward. He did not need to. The conversation was a boat, and he was steering it. And the shore he was steering toward was the question of what came next for Callaway Records and who should be making those decisions. Sarah followed his lead without appearing to. She asked questions that opened the space for him to say what he wanted to say. She nodded at the right moments and leaned forward slightly when he made a point that deserved emphasis. She was not performing this. I do not think she knew she was doing it at all. Ryan had spent enough time with her in the weeks before this dinner to understand how to point her without her feeling pointed. The moment that stayed with me came midway through the meal, during a conversation about the label's direction in the year ahead. Ryan was in the middle of a sentence directed at Sarah when he shifted, briefly, to speak about me as though I had stepped out of the room. He said she looked better, didn't she? He said he had been so worried. He said it the way you say something about a person who is not there to correct you. I was sitting 18 inches to his left. This was the third time he had done it that evening. I had been counting. I did not react. I reached for my glass and took a sip of water and let the moment pass, the way I had learned to let a great many moments pass, by absorbing them quietly and filing them where they would be useful later. After dinner, Ryan stayed to help clear the table. Sarah had gone to the bathroom, and the two of us were alone in the kitchen for the first time that evening. He rinsed a dish and set it on the rack, and then he turned toward me with the particular body language of someone who has been building toward a specific sentence for several hours. He said he had been thinking about my workload. He said he knew how much I had taken on since Dale died, and that it was too much for one person, especially during what he called a period of transition. He said it gently and with what sounded like genuine care. Then he said the sentence he had driven 4 hours to say. He told me he thought I should let him handle the accounting side of things going forward. He said I had done enough. He said I deserved to rest. He was looking at me while he said it, and he held the look steady in the way people do when they want you to believe the offer is coming from love. I looked back at him. I held the expression I had been holding for 3 nights in the office, the expression I had worn for 38 years when I needed a room to read me one way while I was thinking something else entirely. I smiled. It was a real smile in the sense that my face produced one. I told him that was very thoughtful and that I would think about it. Ryan left an hour later. I stood in the kitchen after his headlights cleared the driveway and listened to the house settle back into its usual quiet. I turned on the faucet and washed my hands and stood at the sink for a moment, looking at the soap running clear into the drain. I was not thinking about what Ryan had said. I had not been thinking about it since the moment he said it. I was thinking about the attorney whose name was written on a piece of paper in the locked drawer of Dale's desk, a man whose name did not appear anywhere in the files Ryan had access to, who had no connection to the company's existing legal structure, and who I had an appointment to call the following morning. Ryan thought he had made a suggestion this evening. He had actually handed me a deadline. I had not touched Dale's desk in the 18 months since he died. This was not sentimentality, or at least I did not think of it that way. It was more that the desk had always operated according to a system that only Dale understood, and the one time I had attempted to organize it during the early years of our marriage, he had spent 2 days unable to find anything and finally asked me, with great patience, never to do it again. I had honored that request for 38 years. Even after he was gone, I found I could not quite bring myself to override it. But I needed to look for legal documents, and practical need has a way of moving through sentiment like water through sand. I went into his study on a Sunday afternoon, 3 days after Ryan's dinner, and I stood in front of the desk and looked at it for a moment before I began. It was exactly as he had left it. A legal pad covered in handwriting, a coffee mug he used to hold pens, though most of the pens had long since dried out, a small framed photograph of the two of us from a trip we had taken to the coast the year before his diagnosis, both of us squinting into the sun. His reading glasses folded on top of a catalog from a guitar manufacturer he had always meant to call back. I moved through these objects slowly and with the deliberate care of someone handling things that cannot be replaced. The locked drawer was in the lower left section of the desk. I had known it was there. Dale had mentioned it once or twice over the years, referring to it as his important drawer in the vague, slightly embarrassed way he referred to anything administrative. I had never had a reason to open it. His important drawer had always been, by the quiet logic of our arrangement, none of my business. The key was in a small wooden box on his dresser, the box where he kept the things that did not fit anywhere else, a spare watch battery, a cufflink without its pair, a folded receipt from a restaurant we had loved years ago. I recognized the key immediately. It was small and brass and slightly worn at the teeth. I unlocked the drawer and opened it. There was a thick manila envelope and, sitting on top of it, a piece of paper folded in half. The paper had been torn from a legal pad, and the handwriting was Dale's, larger than his usual hand, the letters pressed firmly into the page, the way his writing looked when he was concentrating on something he found difficult. I picked up the paper and unfolded it. He was not a man who wrote things down. In 38 years, I had received perhaps a dozen notes from him, almost all of them practical. Grocery lists, a phone number to call, the occasional reminder about an appointment. He communicated through presence and gesture and the particular quality of his silences, which I had learned to read the way you learn to read weather. What he had written on that legal pad paper was not long. It was 5 sentences. They were not eloquent sentences. He was not an eloquent man with words on paper, but they said what they said clearly, and without qualification he knew what I had built. He had always known. He wanted to make sure nobody could take it from me. I should open the envelope when I needed to. I would know when. I read it 3 times. The 3rd time, my hands were not entirely steady. I sat down on the floor of his study with my back against the side of the desk because my legs had decided that standing was no longer a reasonable request, and I held the piece of paper and I cried. Not the way I had cried in the weeks after he died, which was in fragments, briefly and without warning, in the cereal aisle and in the car and once in the middle of a conference call that I managed to finish without anyone knowing. This was different. This was the kind of crying that has a specific source, the way a river has a specific source. And the source was 38 years of being known by someone who did not know how to say so, and then losing him before he got the chance, and finding the proof of it folded on a piece of legal pad paper in a locked drawer 18 months too late. He had seen me. He had always seen me. He just hadn't known how to say it while he was alive to say it. I sat there for a while. Then I wiped my face with the sleeve of my sweater and picked up the manila envelope and opened it. The documents inside were legal in nature and dense with formal language, but I had spent 38 years reading documents like this, and the structure revealed itself within the first 2 pages. Dale had established what the paperwork called a music catalog protection trust. The trust contained 847 songs, the core catalog of Callaway Records, the songs that generated the most reliable royalty income, the foundation of everything. The trust was constructed so that no transaction involving those songs could be executed without my signature, verified independently and in person. No one had known about this. Not Ryan, not the company's attorneys, not even me. Until this moment. I set the documents down on Dale's desk and looked at the calendar on the wall beside the window. Ryan had scheduled a board meeting for the following Friday. I counted the days. 7. I had 7 days. I picked up my phone and looked at the name of the attorney Dale had listed at the bottom of the last document page. Then I looked at the clock. It was too late to call tonight, but tomorrow morning, first thing, I would make the call. Dale had given me a weapon. It had been waiting in that drawer for me to be ready to use it. I was ready. That same night, I went to the desk in the spare room where I kept the home computer to print the documents I would need for the attorney meeting the following morning. The printer in the study was the one I trusted for anything important. And I had learned over the years that printing something the night before saved time in the morning, when things were most likely to go wrong. The computer was already on. Sarah had used it during her visit and had done what she almost always did, which was close the browser without logging out of her accounts. Her email was open on the screen when I sat down. I moved the mouse toward the corner of the screen to close the window. I am not a person who reads other people's correspondence. I had been entrusted with confidential financial information for 38 years, and I had never once violated that trust. And the private communications of my daughter operated under the same principle. Then I saw Ryan's name in the subject line of the most recent email. I stopped. I want to be precise about what I did next. I did not tell myself it was acceptable. I did not construct a justification. I simply stopped moving the mouse and read the subject line, and then I read the preview text beneath it, and then I scrolled to the top of the thread to read it from the beginning. I did this the way I had done a great many things in my life that I knew were going to cost me something, deliberately and with full awareness of the price. The thread had begun 14 months earlier. That placed it 4 months after Dale died, in the period when I was still doing what grief does to you in the early stages, which is reduce your world to its most essential functions and strip away everything else. While I had been doing that, Ryan had been writing to my daughter. His first message was careful. He began with expressions of concern for her well-being and for mine. He wrote about the difficulty of the transition and about how important it was to plan properly for the company's future. He used the word family several times. He used the word stability. He did not say directly what he was proposing until the 3rd paragraph, and even then he framed it as a question, a gentle wondering aloud about whether there might be a more sustainable structure for the label going forward, one that could protect everyone involved and ensure that what Dale had built would continue to thrive. Sarah's reply came 2 days later. She said she had been thinking about the same things. She said she agreed that planning was important. She asked one question. She asked what her share would look like under the kind of restructuring he was describing. I sat very still when I read that sentence. Ryan's response was detailed. He had prepared for the question. He laid out a proposed ownership distribution across 4 paragraphs, including specific percentages and projected income figures based on the current catalog valuation. He wrote the numbers with confidence and precision, the way you write numbers when you have already spent time running the calculations and you are certain of the result. Sarah did not ask any follow-up questions. She wrote one sentence. She said that sounded fair and that she trusted him to handle the details. I read to the end of the thread. There were 11 more messages over the following 6 months, each one moving the plan incrementally forward in language that remained careful and warm and never said directly what it was doing. Ryan was skilled at this. I had watched him be skilled at it for years. I sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then I looked at the screen again and thought about the past 14 months, about Sarah's calls every few days, her voice carrying the particular register of concern that I had found comforting, about her visits, more frequent than they had ever been before Dale died, about the questions she had asked about the company, questions I had answered openly because she was my daughter and I had nothing to hide, about the way she had nodded along at Ryan's dinner, the way her presence in the room had given his performance a second body of support. I thought about how much of it had been real. I closed the laptop. I did not do it quickly or with anger. I closed it the way you close something you have finished examining, with a steady hand and a clear head. The room went dark except for the light coming in through the window from the street outside. I did not cry. The drawer in Dale's study had been the last reservoir. There was nothing left for this. I took out my phone and opened the notes application. I typed the date, the account name, and a summary of what the thread contained. I typed it in the flat, precise language of documentation, the way I had been recording information for 38 years. When I was done, I put the phone down and sat in the dark for a while. What I understood, sitting there, was that I was completely alone in this. There was no one who knew what I knew, no one whose position was entirely and reliably on my side, no one I could call tonight and speak freely with. I was the only person in possession of all the pieces. I sat with that for several minutes. I expected it to feel like loss. It did not feel like loss. It felt like clarity. When there is no one else to account for, there are no constraints on what you can do. I did not have to protect anyone's feelings. I did not have to soften anything. I could move in a straight line from where I was to where I needed to be, and nothing was in the way. I had a meeting with an attorney in the morning. I was going to be ready for it. The attorney called at 9 o'clock in the evening. His name was Warren Hale, and Dale had chosen him well. He was a man who spoke with the measured, unhurried precision of someone who had spent decades making sure that what he said could not be misinterpreted. And he had shown, in our meetings earlier that week, a quality I valued above almost everything else in a professional context, which was that he did not waste my time. He told me Ryan had filed a legal response. This was expected. What was less expected was the scope of it. Ryan had not simply disputed the trust documentation or challenged its terms. He had attached a secondary filing, a collection of historical records from the dissolution of Dale's first marriage in 1987. Warren read me the summary over the phone. When he was done, I asked him to send me everything. The documents arrived in my inbox 40 minutes later. I sat at my own desk, the one in the small room I had always used for the quieter kind of work, the room without Dale's belongings and without the particular weight that his study now carried. I opened the files. What Ryan had filed was a record of the asset declaration Dale had submitted to the family court during his divorce from Janet. The documents were official court filings, retrieved from the county archives, and they were, in their way, meticulous. They listed every asset Dale held at the time of the divorce, including the nascent recording company, the equipment, and the catalog of songs that existed at that point, which was small but already represented real value to anyone who understood the industry. The catalog had been valued in the declaration at 70% below its actual market worth at the time. I did not need to check this figure against anything. I knew the company's financial history the way I knew my own handwriting. I had been doing the bookkeeping from the beginning, including in 1987, and I remembered the state of the catalog in that year, what it was worth, and what it was capable of generating. The number Dale had submitted to the court was not an estimate that had gone wrong. An estimate that goes wrong lands somewhere near the truth. This number was constructed to be somewhere else entirely. It was designed to be believed by someone who did not know what they were looking at. Janet had not known what she was looking at. According to the records Ryan had attached, she had been represented by a general practice attorney in a county 40 miles from Nashville, the kind of attorney who handles wills and minor property disputes and does not specialize in the valuation of music industry assets. The kind of attorney who would have accepted Dale's declaration at face value because she lacked the specific knowledge to challenge it. Janet had received a divorce settlement based on a catalog worth, on paper, a fraction of what it was actually worth. She had walked away from the marriage with enough to start over, but not enough to build anything substantial. While the catalog she had partly witnessed being built during their years together continued to grow in value and become the foundation of everything I now owned. Janet died in Memphis in 2019. I knew this because Ryan had attached her obituary. She had worked as an office administrator for the last 20 years of her life. The obituary mentioned Ryan. It did not mention a pension. It did not mention savings. It mentioned that she had been a devoted mother and that services would be private. I set the phone down on the desk and looked at the room around me. The house I lived in was large and well maintained, and full of the things that a prosperous life accumulates over decades. The catalog that paid for its upkeep was the same catalog that had been deliberately undervalued in a courtroom in 1987, so that the woman who was married to Dale before me would leave with less than she was owed. I had not known this when it happened. I want to be clear about that because it is true and because it matters. I had not been involved in Dale's divorce, and I had not seen those documents, and I had not, at any point in 38 years, been told that the financial foundation of the company I spent my life building had been laid partly on an act of deliberate concealment, but I had benefited from it. For 35 years, I had lived on royalty income. That was in part the rightful property of a woman who died without it. I got up from the desk and walked through the house to the back door and went outside. The garden was still and dark, the way it gets late at night when the temperature drops and the neighborhood sounds fade. Dale used to sit in the garden on summer evenings, in the chair nearest the rose bed. I had not moved the chair. I stood and looked at the chair for a while. I had entered this fight believing the lines were clear. Ryan was taking something that did not belong to him. I was protecting something that was rightfully mine. The law agreed with me. The trust documentation agreed with me. Every logical and legal framework I had applied to the situation agreed with me. But the law and the moral truth are not always the same document. And standing in the garden in the dark, looking at Dale's empty chair, I understood for the first time that the question of what I deserved and the question of what had been done in my name were not questions with the same answer. Ryan was not wrong that something had been taken from his mother. He was only wrong about how to respond to it. I went back inside. I had a great deal to think about before morning. I did not sleep that night. This was not unusual during this period, the sleeplessness. But what was unusual was the quality of the wakefulness. Most nights I lay in bed and my mind moved over the same ground in circles, whirring at the same loose threads. This night was different. This night I sat at my desk with the documents spread in front of me, and I did not circle. I went straight through. There were two things I needed to look at directly, and I had been avoiding them both in the way you avoid looking directly at something bright, by approaching it from an angle, keeping it in the periphery. The garden had taken away the angle. I was going to have to look straight. The first was Sarah. I had spent the days since finding the email thread telling myself a series of things about my daughter, that she had been confused, that Ryan had framed the situation in a way that made his proposal sound reasonable, even responsible, that she was grieving and not thinking clearly, and that her silence in the thread was not the same as complicity. I had been telling myself these things because they were easier to carry than the alternative. The alternative was what I had seen when I read the thread with clear eyes. Sarah had known what was being proposed. She had asked, specifically and without prompting, what her share would look like. She had received detailed numbers and she had not raised a concern. She had not called me. She had not told Ryan she needed to think about it. She had said it sounded fair. That was not confusion. That was a choice. The question was not whether I could prove it or what I intended to do with the knowledge. The question was whether I could continue carrying her as an ally when I now understood what she had done. The answer was that I had no choice but to carry it alone, which was where I had been since closing the laptop, and which was, as I had already established, actually workable. The second thing was harder. Ryan was not simply a thief. I had wanted him to be simply a thief because it made the situation simple, and simple situations are easier to move through with confidence. But a person can be a thief and also be responding to something real, and Ryan was both of those things. And pretending otherwise was the kind of comfort I could not afford right now. His mother had been cheated. The instrument of that cheating was the same catalog I had spent 38 years building and protecting, the same catalog that had paid for the house I was sitting in, and every quiet, comfortable thing in it. I had not done the cheating, but the benefit had come to me regardless. I thought about what winning looked like if I did not think about anything else. The trust holds. Ryan is removed from any operational role. The legal proceedings regarding Meridian proceed as the evidence dictates. I keep the catalog, the label, the house. I keep everything. The law gives it to me cleanly. And then I thought about what that meant for the question Dale had left sitting in that chair in the garden. Whether the foundation beneath everything was as solid as I had believed for 38 years, or whether there was a crack running through it that I had never known to look for. I looked at the wedding photograph on the bookshelf across the room. Dale in his dark suit, already squinting slightly in the afternoon light, the expression he always had when he was happy and slightly overwhelmed by it. I had loved that expression. I had spent 38 years watching for it. I was not angry at him. He was gone, and I could not be angry at someone who was gone and could not answer. And besides, I knew him well enough to understand that people contain the capacity for both the things they are proud of and the things they are not. He had done something wrong in that courtroom. He had also, in a locked drawer, tried to protect me in the only way he knew how. Both of those things were true, and neither one canceled the other. The question was what I did now with both of them. I sat there until 4 o'clock in the morning. Then I got up, went to the kitchen, and made 1 cup of coffee. Not 2. 1. I did it deliberately, with full awareness of the choice, and I stood at the counter and drank it slowly before I sat down at the kitchen table with a blank piece of paper and a pen. I did not write a legal strategy. I wrote something else. I wrote what I wanted to be on the other side of this. Not what I wanted to win, but what I wanted to be able to say I had done when it was over. The things that would let me look at myself clearly and not look away. It took about 20 minutes. When I was done, I folded the paper and put it in the pocket of my robe. At 6 o'clock in the morning, I called Warren Hale. He answered on the second ring, which told me he had been awake, which told me he understood what kind of situation this was. I told him I knew what I wanted to do. I told him it was not only what the law required of me. I told him it was what I required of myself. He was quiet for a moment on his end of the line, the careful quiet of a man thinking through implications. And then he said he understood, and that we should meet that morning. I said I would be there at 9. I put the phone down and looked at the blank place on the table where the piece of paper had been. Outside the kitchen window, the sky was beginning to lighten. Nashville coming back, the way it did every morning, without asking anyone's permission. I went to get dressed. The 7 days operated according to a structure I established on the first morning, and did not deviate from once. During the day I went to the office, attended the meetings already on the calendar, and behaved in every visible way like a woman managing routine estate matters who had returned to her regular schedule. In the evenings, I drove to Warren Hale's office across the city, and we worked until late. And then I drove home and slept for a few hours and got up and did it again. The first 2 days were about assembly. Warren confirmed that the trust Dale had established was, in his estimation, the most precisely constructed document of its kind he had encountered in 30 years of estate law. It had been drafted by someone who understood both the instrument and the specific vulnerability it was designed to protect against. The activation process was not complicated. The trust was already in force. What needed to happen was documentation, notification to the appropriate parties, and the preparation of supporting evidence that would make the legal ground beneath us impossible to dispute. Warren had also retained a forensic accountant, a woman named Patricia who had spent 20 years producing the kind of financial analysis that held up in any room and in front of any audience. She worked remotely through those 7 days, building a layered evidentiary record from the transaction data Barbara had first identified. I pulled the financial records myself. I had access to the company systems that Ryan had not thought to restrict, because it had not occurred to him that the woman he assumed was stepping back from the accounting would instead be using her access to compile a 5-year evidentiary record of exactly what had been moved, when, and where it had gone. I worked methodically. Every transaction, every timestamp, every routing path between Callaway Records and Meridian Sound Partners, documented and cross-referenced against the amended distribution contract. On the 3rd day, I passed Ryan in the hallway of the office at 10 in the morning. He was coming out of the conference room with a coffee cup in his hand and his phone against his ear. He saw me and lowered the phone and smiled. I smiled back. It was a good smile, relaxed and ordinary. The kind you produce when someone you are comfortable with passes in a familiar corridor. He had no idea that the previous evening I'd been sitting in Warren Hale's office organizing the evidence of his theft into a binder with color-coded tabs. He returned to his call and walked on. On the 4th day, the internal accountant Ryan had positioned in the finance department sent him a message. I knew this because Warren had quietly arranged for the company email logs to be captured through a process I did not ask him to explain in detail. Ryan learned that I had submitted a request to review the full 5-year transaction history of the label's distribution accounts. That evening he called me. His voice was warm and concerned. He said he had heard I was spending a lot of time on the company finances, and that he worried it was too much for me right now. He said I should think about delegating more. He said he just wanted to make sure I was taking care of myself. He said none of this directly. He constructed it out of pauses and carefully chosen words that communicated the message without ever quite becoming a threat. I thanked him for his concern and told him I was fine and that I would see him at the board meeting. On the 5th day, he called Sarah. I know this because she called me 40 minutes later, her voice carrying the particular worried quality I now recognized as something Ryan had been cultivating for months. She said she had been talking to Ryan and that she was concerned about some of the things he had mentioned. She said she thought maybe I should talk to someone, a professional, someone who could help me process everything. I told her I was managing well and that I appreciated her concern and that I would see her soon. When I put the phone down, I understood that he had run out of other options. Using Sarah was the last move he had. On the evening of the 6th day, Warren and I assembled the 3 binders. The first contained the Meridian documentation. The second contained the trust activation records and the ownership structure. The third contained the 1987 divorce filing and the obituary I had printed from the records Ryan had attached to his own legal filing, which I intended to use in a way he had not anticipated. At 5:47 on the morning of the 7th day, my phone rang. It was Warren. He told me Ryan had filed an emergency motion to move the board meeting forward by 2 days. The meeting was now scheduled for the following morning. I was quiet for 10 seconds. I counted them. Then I told Warren that was fine and that we would be ready. I got dressed in the clothes I had selected 3 days earlier. The black suit I had worn to Dale's funeral, I had chosen it deliberately, not for sentiment, but for precision. I had worn it on the day I buried my husband. I would wear it on the day I reclaimed what he had built. The two events seemed to me to belong together, part of the same long, unfinished sentence I was finally being given the chance to complete. I looked at myself in the mirror. I did not see a widow. I did not see a grieving woman who had been managed and maneuvered through her own loss. I saw the woman who had read every contract and caught every error and kept every promise she had ever made to the thing she had spent her life building. I picked up the binder from the chair beside the door and walked out to my car. I arrived at the office at 9 o'clock exactly, not a minute before. Warren Hale walked in beside me, and behind us came Patricia, the forensic accountant Warren had retained, carrying her laptop and the composed manner of someone who had testified in proceedings far larger than this one. The three of us walked through the lobby and took the elevator to the 4th floor, where the main conference room was located, and I did not look at my phone or speak to anyone we passed in the hallway. The conference room door was open. I could hear voices inside. The low, comfortable murmur of people who believed they were about to conduct a routine meeting. Ryan had arrived early, as I expected he would. He was the kind of person who established dominance through arrival time and physical positioning, who understood that the person already seated when others enter carries a different authority than the person who enters and sits down. He was at the head of the table, in the chair where Dale used to sit, with a thick folder in front of him and a cup of coffee at his right hand. He had come alone, without counsel, which told me everything I needed to know about what he believed this morning was going to be. 3 board members occupied the chairs along the sides of the table. One of them was midway through a sentence when I appeared in the doorway. I did not pause in the doorway. I walked directly to the head of the table, to the chair Ryan was sitting in, and I stopped in front of it. The room went quiet. Ryan looked up. For 1 second, not more. His expression did something it almost never did. It showed him. The careful confidence he maintained at all times, the practiced ease that I had watched him deploy across every room he had ever entered, flickered. He had not expected me to walk directly to him. He had expected me to take a seat along the side of the table, to position myself as a participant in a meeting he was running, which was where he had placed me in every version of this moment he had rehearsed. I had not rehearsed that version. I looked at him and said, in the same voice I would have used to note a discrepancy in a quarterly report, that he was sitting in my chair. He stood up. He did it with reasonable composure, shifting to the adjacent seat and saying something brief and dismissive about not having realized, producing the kind of easy recovery that people who have spent years managing impressions keep ready for exactly this kind of moment. But the second had already happened. The board members had seen it. Warren had seen it, and I had seen it, which was the only one that mattered to me. I sat down at the head of the table. I placed the 3 binders in front of me, aligned precisely with the edge of the wood, and set my hands flat on the cover of the first one. Warren took the seat to my left. Patricia opened her laptop at the far end of the table and said nothing. I looked at the board members, not at Ryan. This was deliberate. everything that followed was addressed to the people in this room who had not yet made up their minds, because Ryan's mind was not a variable I needed to influence. What I needed was for the board to understand what they were being asked to authorize and what the full context of that authorization was. I opened the first binder. Over the next 12 minutes, I presented the Meridian documentation. I did not use the word theft. I did not raise my voice or introduce language designed to produce an emotional response. I presented the structure of the distribution contract amendment, the routing of funds to Meridian Sound Partners, the 5-year transaction record, and the forensic accounting analysis Patricia's firm had produced. I placed a copy of the summary in front of each board member. I spoke at the pace of someone who has accounted for every question that might arise and has the answer ready before the question is finished. Ryan interrupted twice. The first time he said the Meridian arrangement was a legitimate operational expense, covered by a properly executed contract amendment. Warren produced the original contract, the amended version, and a 3-page analysis identifying 12 specific points at which the amendment deviated from standard industry practice in ways that benefited only the receiving entity. Ryan stopped talking. The second time, he said the transaction record was being mischaracterized. Patricia read 3 lines from her own report without looking up from her laptop. Ryan stopped talking again. When the first binder was finished, I closed it and opened the second. The trust documentation was 2 pages of clear language and a certified copy of the activation filing Warren had submitted earlier that week. I read the relevant section aloud. 847 songs. No transaction involving those songs could be executed without my verified signature. The board meeting Ryan had called to advance his restructuring proposal could not proceed without my consent. The restructuring itself, which required transferring catalog assets to a new entity, could not proceed without my consent. Nothing Ryan had planned for this morning could proceed without my consent, because the asset at the center of every plan he had made for the past several years was not his to plan around. I watched Ryan look at the trust documentation. I watched the color in his face shift in the way that color shifts when a person understands something they cannot argue with. It is a specific kind of change. Not anger, not grief. Something quieter and more final. The expression of a calculation that has just arrived at a result the person doing the calculation did not want. The 3 board members were looking at the binders now. Not at Ryan. They were reading. That was the only confirmation I needed. I had 1 more binder. The room did not know that yet. I reached for the 3rd binder. No one in the room expected this. I could see it in the stillness that settled over the table when I placed it to my right, instead of pushing back my chair to indicate I was finished. Warren did not react, because he already knew. Patricia continued looking at her screen. The board members, who had been leaning into their copies of the trust documentation, looked up. Ryan looked up. This time, I did not direct my attention to the board. I looked at Ryan. It was the first time in the entire meeting that I had looked directly at him with the specific intention of being seen by him rather than simply presenting information to the room. He registered this. I watched him register it, Something in his posture shifted, a small, involuntary adjustment, the body's way of preparing for something it does not yet recognize, but senses is coming. I placed the third binder on the table and opened it without rushing. The first page was the 1987 Divorce Asset Declaration. I did not need to explain what it was, because Ryan already knew. He had filed it himself as part of his own legal response, believing it was a weapon he was handing to his attorneys. He had not considered the possibility that I would retrieve it from his filing and bring it to this room, or that I would present it the way I was about to present it. I said, without preamble, that I knew about his mother. The quality of the silence that followed was different from anything that had preceded it. The earlier silences in that room had been the silence of tension, of people waiting for a legal argument to resolve. This silence was something else. It was the silence of a room that had suddenly understood the meeting it was in was not the meeting it thought it was attending. I presented the facts of the 1987 Declaration the way I had presented everything else that morning, without theater and without excess. I described the asset declaration Dale had submitted to the family court. I described the catalog's actual value at that time, which I had verified through 3 independent sources in the weeks preceding this meeting. I described the difference between what Janet had been offered and what she would have been entitled to had the catalog been accurately represented. I described what she did with the settlement she received, the apartment she could afford, the work she did for 20 years, the way her obituary read. I did not editorialize. I did not say Dale was a dishonest man. I did not say Ryan was owed anything. I presented the documentary record and I let it speak in the language it already knew, which was the language of numbers, and numbers are patient and do not require interpretation. When I finished, I looked at Ryan again. He was looking at me, not the way he had looked at me at dinner, where his eyes had carried the practiced warmth of a performance, not the way he had looked at me in the hallway, where the smile had been a tool. He was looking at me the way a person looks at someone who has said something they did not expect to be said, and who is trying to understand what it means that it was said. I told him I knew what Dale had done. I told him I had not known it when it happened. I told him I had lived for 35 years on income that was in part the rightful property of his mother, and that I could not pretend otherwise now that I knew, and that I would not pretend otherwise. I paused. Then I told him this was not the right way. I said it simply and without anger, the way you tell someone a fact they already know, but have been refusing to look at directly. I said that taking $3.1 million from the company, framing it as a distribution expense, and using a shell entity to obscure the trail was not an answer to what had been done to his mother. It was an answer to something else, something inside him that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with the particular hunger that grows in people who have been told all their lives that they were owed something and never given a clear way to collect. I said I knew that hunger. I said I understood it was real. And then I said it had brought us to a room where a woman who had also been wronged, in different ways and on different scales, was going to spend the next several months in legal proceedings that would benefit no one and exhaust everyone, and that, if there was another way he was willing to consider, I was willing to have that conversation, but not in this room. Not today. Today, the only thing in this room was what the documents contained. Ryan did not respond. He looked down at the table. I gave Warren a brief look, the signal we had agreed on before entering the room. He slid a copy of the third binder across the table, and Ryan looked down at the open pages. He found the page with his mother's name on it. He sat with that for a long moment, and the room stayed quiet, and nobody moved. Then he pushed his chair back and stood up. He gathered nothing from the table. He walked to the door and opened it and left. The door closed behind him without force, a quiet mechanical click that was the smallest sound the room had produced all morning. I looked at the empty chair where he had been sitting. The board members were looking at me. Warren was looking at me. I had nothing more to add. I closed the third binder and folded my hands on top of the cover and waited for someone else to speak first. When the board members moved to an executive discussion, I left the conference room without waiting for the outcome. I knew the outcome. The trust activation was documented. The Meridian evidence was irrefutable, and the three people on the other side of that table had just spent 2 hours reading materials that gave them no reasonable alternative to the conclusion I had already reached 3 weeks earlier. Warren would handle the procedural close. That was what attorneys were for. I walked through the hallway. The building was doing its normal late morning business around me. People moving between offices with the purposeful distraction of people who have things on their calendars and places they are expected. I took the elevator down to the lobby and walked through the glass doors and out onto the street. I stood on the sidewalk in front of the building and looked up at the sign, Callaway Records. The same sign it had been for 30 years. The same font, the same proportions, the same materials I had been consulted on when we chose them in the early 90s, and which had never been changed because Dale believed that things that worked did not need to be improved. I had looked at that sign on the way into work for 30-something years, and I had thought of it as the company's name, which was true, and as Dale's name, which was also true, and occasionally as evidence of my own invisibility, which was true in a way I had only recently learned to look at clearly. Standing there on the sidewalk in the morning light, I looked at the sign and did not see any of those things. I saw the thing I had built. I saw the weight of the work and the years and the 11 o'clock phone calls and the clauses caught in the 5th addendum and the distributor who would have taken everything in 2003 and the quarterly reports and the filing systems and all the invisible architecture that kept the name on that sign from meaning nothing. It had always been mine. I had simply not been permitted to say so. I stood there for a while. The city moved around me at its usual indifferent pace. People passing without noticing a woman, standing still on a sidewalk looking at a sign. I was grateful for that. Then I walked to my car and drove to Warren's office to begin the paperwork. The legal proceedings concluded the following week. Ryan had no viable legal standing to contest the trust. Meridian Sound Partners had its assets frozen, pending a regulatory review that Warren had initiated through the appropriate financial channels. The ownership structure of Callaway Records was formally amended to reflect what had always been true in practice and was now, finally, true on paper as well. My name appeared in the documents in the capacity it had earned. On a Thursday afternoon, 11 days after the board meeting, I sat in Warren's office and asked him to calculate something. I wanted to know the value of the settlement Janet should have received from the 1987 divorce, adjusted for the actual catalog valuation at that time, plus 35 years of standard interest accrual. Warren looked at me across the desk. He said I was not legally required to do anything with that number. He said the trust, the ownership structure, and all the legal proceedings were entirely separate from the domestic arrangements of Dale's first marriage, which had been settled by a court of law at the time, and which carried no legal liability for me. I told him I knew that. I told him that was why I wanted to do it. He calculated the figure. When he told me the number, I did not flinch or negotiate. I told him to proceed with the establishment of a foundation in the name of Janet Callaway, funded at that amount, with the stated purpose of providing financial support to single women working in the Nashville music industry who faced the kind of economic precarity that a more equitable outcome might have spared Janet from facing herself. I did not issue a press release. I did not send a notification to Ryan. I did not mention it to Sarah or to anyone at the company. I simply told Warren to proceed and to ensure that the foundation's operations were managed by an independent board entirely unconnected to Callaway Records. 2 weeks later, Warren placed the founding documents in front of me. I read through them the way I read everything, carefully and without rushing. And when I was satisfied, I signed on the designated line. I set the pen down on the surface of the desk. I looked at the documents for a moment. Then I looked out the window at the city. I want to try to describe what happened in my chest when I set that pen down, because it is not something I have the right language for, and I have thought about it a great deal since. It was not relief in the way that relief usually presents itself, not the sudden loosening of tension or the warm rush of conclusion. It was more like the end of a sound that had been present for so long I had ceased to hear it as a sound, and had instead experienced it as the ordinary texture of my interior life. When it stopped, the quiet was so complete and so different from anything I had known in recent memory that I sat in it for a long time without moving. I drove home in the early evening. The sky over Nashville was doing the thing it sometimes does in late autumn, going orange and deep red at the edges in a way that looks deliberate, like someone has made a choice about it. I rolled down the window on the driver's side and let the air move through the car. I did not turn on the radio or the music system. I just drove and breathed and watched the sky do what it was doing without needing anything from me at all. Sarah came on a Wednesday afternoon without calling first. I heard the car in the driveway and looked out the kitchen window and saw her getting out, moving in the particular way she moves when she has been driving for a while and is relieved to have arrived somewhere. She stood beside the car for a moment, looking at the front of the house, and I stepped back from the window before she could see me watching her. I went to the front door and opened it before she knocked. We stood in the doorway for 1 second, the two of us, with the afternoon light behind her and the house behind me. She looked like she had not slept well. She looked like she had been carrying something heavy for a while and was trying to decide whether to put it down. I stepped to the side and let her in. We went to the kitchen, not the living room, where the furniture arranges itself for polite company and the conversation stays manageable. The kitchen, where everything real in this house had always happened. I filled the kettle and put it on the stove and took 2 cups down from the cabinet and set them on the table. I sat down. Sarah sat across from me. The kettle took a few minutes. We waited through that time without speaking, and the silence was not the silence of 2 people who have nothing to say. It was the silence of 2 people who have so much to say that neither one knows where to begin, and who have both decided, without discussing it, to let the silence breathe for a while before they ask it to do anything else. I made the tea. I set a cup in front of her and wrapped my hands around my own. I looked at the window. Outside the kitchen window, the garden was doing what gardens do in late afternoon, shadows going long and the light going sideways and particular. Sarah looked at me. I looked back at her. She knew that I knew. This was not something that needed to be said. It was present in the room the way all the unspoken true things are present in a room, once they have been understood by both people on opposite sides of a table, sitting with a weight between them that both of them can feel. She opened her mouth. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers, not to stop her, not to signal impatience, but to say what hands sometimes say when words would take too long or go to the wrong place. I held her hand for a moment, and then I said what I had decided to say, which was that she did not have to explain herself to me. I told her she just had to be real with me from now on. Sarah did not respond right away. She looked down at the table, at our hands, at the cup of tea she had not yet touched. I watched her face do the work that faces do when something has been said that shifts the ground, and the person has to find their footing again in a slightly different place. Then she cried. Not the way people cry when they are asking for forgiveness or performing grief. She cried the way people cry when they have been extended something they did not expect to be given and are not sure they deserve. And the unexpectedness of it is what breaks through. I did not tell her I forgave her. I do not know if that is accurate yet. Forgiveness, the real kind, is not something you can rush or manufacture on a schedule. And I had been honest with myself for long enough during this period to know that pretending to a completeness I had not reached would serve neither of us. What I could honestly say was that I was choosing to continue, that I was choosing to sit in this kitchen with her and drink tea and let the afternoon go past outside the window and not make this moment the last one between us. If that is not forgiveness, it is at least something. It is the thing that comes before forgiveness, the thing that makes forgiveness possible later. We sat there for a while after she stopped crying. We drank the tea. I looked out the window. She looked at her hands. There is a kind of companionship that does not require talking, that two people can enter when they have known each other long enough to trust the silence. And we found our way into it that afternoon, the way you find your way into something you have not done in a while, carefully and with some relief at discovering it is still available. Sarah left when the sky outside had gone dark. She gathered her jacket from the chair where she had put it, and I walked her to the door, and she hugged me in the same doorway where she had arrived. And it was a different hug from the one at Ryan's dinner, less careful, less managed. I stood on the porch and watched her car back out of the driveway and turn down the street. I watched the taillights until they disappeared around the corner. I thought about 38 years of staying quiet to keep the peace. I thought about how I had absorbed and accommodated and chosen silence so many times across so many years, and had called all of those choices love, and how some of them were, and some of them were not. I had not passed that particular habit on to my daughter deliberately, but habits of accommodation spread through families the way languages do, through exposure and imitation and the gradual assumption that this is simply how things are done. I did not want her to have it from me. Whatever else she took from me, not that. I went back inside. I carried the 2 cups to the sink and rinsed them and set them in the rack. I turned off the kitchen light and stood in the quiet house for a moment before I went to bed. 3 months after the board meeting, on a Tuesday morning in early spring, Warren Hale placed a document in front of me in his office, and I signed it. There was no ceremony. There was no gathering of staff or announcement in the trade publications or champagne or any of the other things that people sometimes attach to significant milestones to make them feel proportionate to their meaning. There was a conference table and 2 chairs, and a certified copy of the amended ownership structure of Callaway Records, with my name typed in the appropriate field. And Warren's assistant notarized the signature. And that was that. Warren walked me to the elevator afterward. He shook my hand in the hallway and said something brief and appropriate, and I thanked him for everything he had done. And then the elevator doors opened and we went our separate ways. I drove to the office. I parked in the back lot in the corner spot I had parked in for 35 years, and I walked in through the side entrance and said good morning to the people I passed, and went to my desk. The desk did not have a nameplate on the door. I had not added one. It would not have seemed right to do it suddenly, after all this time, as though the answer to 38 years of invisibility was a small rectangle of engraved metal. The answer was the document I was carrying, and I knew where I was going to put it. I opened the bottom drawer and placed the document inside, face up. In the back of the drawer, where I kept the few personal items that had made their way into this room over the years, there was a small photograph in a paper frame that had softened and bent slightly at the corners from being pressed between other things. It was a photograph from the first year Dale and I opened the company, taken by someone whose name I no longer remembered, at a moment when we were standing in the original recording studio looking at a piece of equipment that had just been delivered. Dale was pointing at something, one arm extended, in the middle of saying something that I could no longer hear, but that had clearly been important to him in that moment. I was looking at him and laughing. I looked at the photograph for a moment. Then I placed the document flat in the drawer beside it and closed the drawer and went back to work. Ryan had not been in contact. I was aware, through Warren, that a federal inquiry had been initiated regarding the Meridian Sound Partners transactions, not at my instigation, but through the regional bank's own compliance process, which had flagged certain irregularities during a routine review. I did not follow the proceedings. It was not my fight anymore. Whatever accountability came from that direction would come from systems designed for exactly that purpose. And I had done my part by ensuring the forensic documentation was complete and accessible. What happened next was between Ryan and the institutions he had spent years learning to circumvent. The Janet Calloway Foundation received its first application in the second week of February. The applicant was a woman of 34, a single mother with 2 children, who had been writing songs in Nashville for 11 years and had twice come close to a publishing deal that did not materialize. She was working 3 part-time jobs to cover rent and child care, and continuing to write in the hours between. The application was thorough and the work samples were honest, and the need was clear. I read through the entire file on a Thursday evening at my desk and approved it before I left for the night. I did not tell anyone I had done it. I simply filed the approval with the foundation's administrator and turned off the light. Sarah called every week. The calls were not long, usually 15 minutes, sometimes 20. She did not call to discuss the things that had happened, or to revisit the kitchen conversation, or to work through anything that required working through. She called to tell me ordinary things, what her week looked like, something that had happened at work, a movie she had seen and thought I might like. The calls were the kind that people make when they want someone to know they are present and not drifting. I answered every one. On a Friday afternoon in late March, I went down to the original recording studio on the ground floor. It was the room that Dale and I had built in 1988, the first real space the company had occupied, and it was still in use, though the equipment had been updated many times since the beginning, and very little of the original hardware remained. What remained was the room itself, the dimensions of it, and the way the sound sat in the particular silence of a well-constructed studio, which is a silence that sounds different from any other kind of silence. I sat down in the producer's chair, the one in front of the main console. I found the archive of early recordings in the system, and I put on a session from 1989, one of the first albums the label had ever produced. The music came through the monitors and filled the room. It was not a famous recording. It had not made anyone particularly well known. It was simply the sound of people in a room trying to make something as good as they could make it with what they had. I sat and listened. I did not take notes or think about the schedule or check my phone. I just listened to the music that the company had made in its first years, when everything was still uncertain, and the work was the only thing that mattered. And the room held it the way rooms hold things that are left in them long enough, with something that is not quite memory, but is close to it. When the session ended, I sat in the quiet that followed for a while. Then I turned off the console and went back upstairs. I woke up at 5:47 in the morning, the same time I had been waking up for 38 years, through habit and through whatever it is in the body that keeps time, even when you would prefer it did not. I lay on my back for a moment and looked at the ceiling. The room was quiet. The house was quiet. Nashville outside the window was in that particular state of early morning that exists between the end of night and the beginning of the city's ordinary noise, when the first light is present but has not yet committed to anything. I got up. I went to the kitchen. This is the part I want to tell carefully, because it matters, and because the difference between what I did now and what I did on the morning I returned to the office for the first time is small in terms of action and significant in terms of everything else. I reached up into the cabinet and I took out 1 cup, not 2. 1. I had been doing this for several months now, and there were still mornings when my hand reached for the second one before my mind caught up with the intention. But this was not one of those mornings. This morning I took 1 cup down with full awareness of what I was doing and set it on the counter and made my coffee. I took the cup to the back of the house, where a narrow covered porch looked out over the garden, and I stood there in the cool early air and drank. The garden was beginning to come back from winter. The rosebed Dale had maintained was showing its first green this season, small, tight leaves emerging from canes that had looked bare and defeated all through January and February. I had not tended the roses myself. I had done what I knew to do, which was leave them alone and let them do the thing they were designed to do, which was come back when the temperature allowed. I had thought more than once, standing at the porch rail watching them, that there was something in that I had not fully understood before this year. The sky above the rooftops was doing what April skies do in Nashville, which is move through stages of color with an unhurried confidence that does not require anyone's attention to proceed. Gray to pale blue, to the particular luminous quality that comes in the 20 minutes before the sun appears at the horizon. I thought about Dale, not with anger, which is where I started in the months after I found the 1987 documents, and where I did not stay. The anger was real and warranted, and I let myself feel it fully, and then it became something else, not forgiveness in the clean, complete sense that the word implies, something more lived in than that. Something that accommodates the knowledge of what he did in that courtroom, alongside the way he looked in the photograph in my desk drawer, pointing at equipment and absolutely certain that what he was saying was important. I stood at the porch rail with my coffee and held both things at once, the way the morning holds the dark and the light in the same moment before the sun clears the rooftops. I thought about Ryan, I did not check the federal proceedings. I had made a deliberate decision not to track that story, and I had kept to it. What I knew was what Warren told me in our periodic check-ins, which was that the inquiry was progressing and that Ryan had retained counsel. Beyond that, it was not my story to follow. I had handed it to the systems designed for it, and I had stepped back. I thought about the woman whose application the foundation had approved, the 34-year-old with 2 children and 11 years of songs that had not yet found their way to the right ears. I thought about what it would mean to her to have a year in which the financial pressure was different, in which the 3 part-time jobs could become 2 or 1, in which the hours available for the work might expand. I had approved the application quietly on a Thursday evening at my desk, without ceremony, and I hoped the time would be useful to her in ways she had not yet anticipated. Sarah called every week. The calls were not long, usually 15 minutes, sometimes 20. She did not call to discuss the things that had happened, or to revisit the kitchen conversation, or to work through anything that required working through. She called to tell me ordinary things, what her week looked like, something that had happened at work, a movie she had seen and thought I might like. The calls were the kind that people make when they want someone to know they are present and not drifting. I answered every one. The sun reached the horizon. The light changed the way it changes in that specific moment, from ambient to directional, from the general illumination of morning to the particular gold that comes when the source becomes visible. The garden caught it first, the green of the rose leaves going suddenly bright, and then the rooftops, and then the sky itself, which had been working its way toward this for the past half hour, and arrived at it with no more ceremony than it arrives at anything. I stood there and let it happen around me. I did not need to do anything with it. The morning was going to proceed regardless of whether I narrated it, or analyzed it, or tried to extract its meaning. The meaning was simply this. I was standing in my garden in the early morning with 1 cup of coffee that I had made for myself, and the city was doing what it always did, and I was still here. I finished my coffee. The cup was warm until it was not. I went back inside. There were things I had learned from the past 2 years that I had not yet tried to say out loud. I thought it was time. I am going to speak to you directly for a moment, because that is what the past 2 years have asked of me, and I am learning not to refuse what is asked. Not because I believe my account is definitive, or because the version I arrived at will suit every person who hears this story, but because I spent most of my life learning to keep the important things to myself, and I am done with that now. The first thing is about love and disappearing. I spent 38 years standing behind the person I had chosen to spend my life with, and I called that standing behind love. Some of it was the part where I worked without recognition because I genuinely wanted the thing we were building to succeed was love. The part where I stayed quiet to keep the peace, where I chose accommodation over honesty because I was afraid of what honesty might cost me. The part where I told myself I did not need my name on a piece of paper because a heart does not need its name on the wall. those parts were not love. Those parts were fear, dressed in the clothing of love. Love does not require you to disappear. Love is not diminished by being seen. If you are standing behind someone because you genuinely want to, and you have genuinely chosen it, that is one thing. If you are standing behind someone because you have taught yourself that your own visibility is a cost someone else might have to pay, that is something else entirely. Know the difference. The second thing is about justice. Real justice is not winning. I won in the legal sense of the word, and there were moments in that winning that felt correct and proportionate to what had happened. But real justice, the kind that you can carry without it changing shape on you, required more than winning. It required me to look at the foundation of what I was defending and acknowledge the crack that ran through it. It required me to take the thing that Janet Calloway had been denied and do something useful with it. I could have kept every dollar and been legally in the right. What I could not have done is stood on that back porch this morning with my coffee and felt what I felt, which was the particular weightlessness of a person who has done what she believed she was required to do, not only by the law, but by herself. Justice that you cannot live with afterward is not justice. It is just winning. The third thing is about forgiveness. People who have hurt you will sometimes, eventually, want to be forgiven. They will want to be welcomed back. They will want the relationship restored to what it was before they did what they did, or to something that resembles it closely enough that everyone can proceed without the discomfort of accounting. I am not going to tell you that you owe them that. Forgiveness, the kind that is genuinely good for you, is something you do privately and for your own sake, so that you are not spending your remaining years carrying the weight of someone else's choices in your own chest. That kind of forgiveness does not require their presence. It does not require a conversation. It does not require you to see them again. You can release someone without inviting them back. You can put down the weight without handing it back to the person who gave it to you. These are not the same thing. And nobody is entitled to demand that you treat them as though they are. The fourth thing is about the people you love who fail you. Sarah and I are still figuring out what we are to each other after everything that happened. I would be lying if I told you it was simple or that the kitchen conversation resolved it. It did not resolve it. It began something, which is different. What I have learned is that the people we love are capable of choosing badly, including at our expense, without becoming enemies. They remain the people they are, with the good and the bad of that together. And what we have to decide is not whether they are worth loving despite the bad, but whether we are capable of holding the full picture of them the way we would want them to hold the full picture of us. I am not capable of perfect love, but I think we are both willing to try for the real kind, which is messier and less reassuring, and, I suspect, more durable. The fifth thing is about age. I am 65 years old. Society has a great many ideas about what 65 means, about what a woman of that age is capable of, what she should want, how much space she should take up, how much time she has left to do anything worth doing. I spent the first 64 years of my life accommodating those ideas in small ways, without noticing I was doing it. I am not interested in accommodating them anymore. If there is anything I would want you to take from this story, it is not the specifics of what I did or how I did it. It is the underlying fact that I did it at 65, after 38 years of standing behind someone, after a grief I was not sure I would survive, after a night I spent alone with two truths that did not make me comfortable. I did it anyway, and I am still standing. So are you. Whatever brought you to this story, whatever weight you are carrying right now, whatever choice is in front of you that you have been putting off because you are not sure you are still the kind of person who makes choices like that, I want to tell you that you are. The question is not whether the time has passed. The question is what you do with the morning you still have. So that is my story. I want to sit with you in it for one more moment before I let you go, because endings deserve as much honesty as beginnings, and I want to be honest about where I am today. Callaway Records is operating. I am running it the way I have always run it, which is carefully and without announcement, except that now my name appears in the places it should have appeared all along, and I have stopped apologizing for taking up the space. The Janet Callaway Foundation has approved its second grant application, 3 months after the first. A woman in East Nashville who has been writing songs in her kitchen after her children go to sleep will spend the next year writing songs without worrying about the electric bill. I think about her sometimes when I am at the office, in the way that you think about something you started that has not yet told you what it is going to become. Sarah called yesterday. We talked for 20 minutes about ordinary things. She told me about a book she was reading and asked my opinion about something that had happened at work. And at the end, she said she would call again next week. She has said that every week for several months now, and she has kept to it. That matters to me. I do not know yet what we will build from here, but I know that something is being built. And I know that it is being built with honesty now, which is the only material worth using. The rose bed in the garden that Dale used to maintain is coming in well this season. I have been watching it from the porch in the mornings, the way green things advance when you leave them to it. I was thinking the other morning that I might plant something new along the back wall this year, something that was mine to choose. I have not decided yet what, but I am thinking about it, which is the beginning of a thing. The mornings are different now, not dramatically different, not the kind of different that announces itself. Just the ordinary difference between a person who is living in their space and a person who has been permitted to visit it. I wake up at the same time. I make the same coffee. But the house is mine, and the chair I sit in is the chair I chose. And the silence in the early morning is not a silence I am trying to make myself small enough not to disturb. It is just quiet. It is just mine. I am standing in the kitchen now the way I stood in the kitchen at the beginning of this story. and there is one cup on the counter. I want you to understand what that means, because it is not the same as the one cup I described in the first days after Dale died, when I was still reaching for two and having to remind myself. This cup is different. This cup I took down knowing it was the one I wanted, without hesitation, without the hand moving toward the second place out of habit. This is the cup I chose. That is what 2 years looks like, in the end. Not a different life, entirely. The same kitchen, the same house, the same Nashville outside the window doing what it always does, but a cup taken down with intention, a rose bed watched with something approaching patience, a phone call answered and another one expected, a name on a document in a drawer beside a photograph of a man who is both the person in the locked drawer and the person in the courtroom, and who I am still figuring out how to carry, and who I carry anyway, because that is what love looks like when it has been lived long enough to become complicated. I am still here. I have always been here, and now, for the first time, I am standing at the front. That is where I will leave you. But before I do, I want to ask you something, and I want you to know I am asking it sincerely, not as a formality. Tell me in the comments about a time you had to choose the harder true thing over the easier, comfortable thing. Tell me about a morning that was different because of a choice you made, even a small one. I read everything, every word, and I would rather know what your story sounds like than have you walk away from this one without leaving any trace of yourself behind. If this story found its way to something in you, please share it. Not because the numbers on a screen mean anything to me, but because there is someone out there who needs to hear that they are not the only person who has stood in a kitchen in the early morning, wondering if there is still enough time to do the thing they have been afraid to do. There is. There is always enough time for the next right thing. That is all any morning is. If you want to hear more stories like this one, told with honesty and without the parts left out that make everything look cleaner than it is, then subscribe to this channel and come back. I will be here. I have practice at that. One more thing, and then I will let you go. Take care of yourself the way you would take care of someone you love, not as an afterthought, not in the time that is left over after everything else. First, take care of yourself first, and watch what becomes possible from there. The coffee is warm. Nashville is doing what it does. I am going to drink this cup and go to work. Thank you for listening to my story until the very end.